Today, we are going to begin our discussion of market failures. In particular, we're going to look at the market failure that deals with income inequality. In the previous chapter, we discussed the labor market. And as a result of your involvement in the labor market, you would probably earn an income. And the reality is, in our market system that we have now, incomes are not equal across the board. There is a difference in the incomes that people earn. There's a variety of reasons why that exists, and there's also some possible solutions for how to deal with this particular market failure. And this is a market failure that I have a keen interest in the sense that I do not want people to believe that because a person earns a different income, they have a different value. Income does not define value. Income is simply what you're receiving from a job, for example. So when we think of income, we often just think of the wages that you're earning. But the wages that a person earns does not determine their value. They are valuable because they are human beings. And I do want to emphasize that, that when you look at other individuals, don't label them because of their income level. Look at them as human beings. So typically when we think of income, we really are just thinking of, the wages, the payment that you're going to receive in exchange for labor. However, income can also arise from a variety of other sources. For example, you may have some land that you rent to a farmer so the farmer can grow corn and soybean, and the rent that you earn would be income. You might have a machine that you rent out to other individuals. That might be income. So payments for any factor of production might be considered income. Truthfully, sometimes people consider gifts as income, especially if they were regular gifts. For example, I know that when our children were smaller, they did receive an allowance, and that was partly so that they understood how to budget. The allowance wasn't very much, but they began to learn how to budget a flow of money, which is income. We'll discuss a little bit later transfer payments and what those look like. But there's a variety of transfer payments that are out there in which the government transfers money from one set of individuals to another set of individuals. So they're transferring income from person to person. There's also a perception that income and wealth are the same thing, and they are not. You can actually be very wealthy and yet have very little income. You could actually have a lot of income and very little wealth. Wealth is viewed more as a stock, whereas income is viewed more as a flow resource. So for example, if you're just imagine water, wealth would be sort of like a lake. There's nothing coming in, it's just a pool of money. And income would be more like a river. There's a flow of income. So when we look at income and we want to look at how it's distributed, one of the key ways that we do that is to look at where the income is allocated based on different groupings of individuals. If you've been watching the news in the last 5 to 10 years, you've probably heard the phrase, the 1%. The 1% earns all the money and that sort of thing. Well, what does that mean, the 1%? So these are groupings of people, and the way we look at income distributed among these groupings of people is sort of a relative measure. So let's start by looking at what this distribution would look like if we had perfect equality. If we had perfect equality. So if we lined up all the people in the country, say in front of a classroom, and we had the first 20% of that line, they got 20% of the income that was in the population. You would have a point on a graph that looked like that. And then if you looked at the first 40% of people, and if they had 40% of the income, you would get another point that looked like that, and on and on. And really what you end up with is a 45-degree line. This is what's called a line of equality. So you'll notice on the x-axis, it has the percent of total population. So just imagine the population is lined up at the front of a classroom. The first 20% earn 20% of the money. The first 40% of people earn 40% of the money. Obviously, 100% of the people earn 100% of the money. So that's what perfect equality would look like. But the reality is we don't have perfect equality in the United States. So if the poorest 20%, if the lowest 20% of the people only held 3.5% of all the income that was earned in the United States, you would get a point on the graph that looked like that. Notice it's off the line of equality. If we continued up the line and we added on to that and said the bottom 40% only earn 12.6% of all the income that's earned, you would get another point on that graph. And then if you went even further and said the bottom 60% earn 27.1% of all the income that's earned in the country, and you continued such that 80% of the population only holds about 50% of all the income that's earned in the population. So you notice what I'm getting is they're points that are underneath that line of equality. So the line of equality is hypothetical, but these are actual points. So half of the income in the United States is held by the lowest 80% of the population. So what does that mean about the other half of the income? It must be earned by the top 20% of the population. So obviously 100% of the population holds 100% of the income. But notice what we have when we connect the dots, we get a curve. And this curve is what's called a Lorenz curve. And the Lorenz curve is just a way that we can graphically illustrate the distribution of income within a population. So when we look at this Lorenz curve, we have this line of perfect equality, which is hypothetical, and then the actual distribution. The distance between the line of equality and the actual distribution will show us how inequitably the income is distributed. So the further we are away from the line of equality, the more inequitable the distribution of income. So again, the Lorenz curve is just a graphical representation of the distribution of our income. It has that perfectly straight line, which represents income equality, and that's hypothetical. And then the further away from the line of equality that your Lorenz curve is, the more unequal your income is distributed. So we've often heard the phrase, oh, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And the line of thinking is that income is becoming more inequitable through time. So the book presents a graph, and I present a graph. We're using different years, but the same trend holds. If you were to compare these particular time eras, the current time period versus around the time of the Great Depression, you actually would see that we're actually becoming closer to the line of equality relative to the time during the Great Depression. However, if you were to pick different years, you might get a different representation. So one of the ways that we look at our income distribution, we look at it through time, and we say, okay, the lowest 20% of our population back in 1947, they held 5.1% of the income. Now the lowest 20% only hold 3.2% of all the income. So the lowest 20% is holding less income. So that again gives you that perception that, okay, the poor are getting poorer. And if you look at the top 20%, they went from a 43% in 1947 to a 51% in 2015. So it looks like the rich are holding a bigger portion of the income. Okay, but again, if you were to pick different years, you would get different representation. And so if you were to look from 1947 to 1960, you might actually say, well, the top 20% is holding less income than they did in 1947. So you have to watch your data and the years that you're looking at. But if you look through time, you can see an overall trend. So in this graph, this is the real average income, the median income through time. So if you've had a statistics class, median income essentially is the income level at which half of the people earn below it and half of the people earn above it. So you'll notice that up until about 1977, all of the brackets, whether it was the top 20% or the top 10%, they all held fairly close to the red line, which is your median income. And then after about 1977, then we started to get some divergence in which that top tier, that top 90th percentile actually started to earn more, and the bottom tier actually stabilized. So if you look through time, it may not actually be interpreted that the poorest are getting poorer. The wealthier, the richer are seeming to be getting richer. However, the poor seem to have stabilized almost since 1977. So you may ask, well, what happened in 1977 to cause this great divergence? There's a variety of factors at play during that time period. You can take an entire class in trying to decipher what happened in 1977. Politics came into play, different welfare programs came into play, different laws that were enacted relating to how minimum wage would be calculated, different kinds of programs that the government created. All these sorts of trends start to come into play. So one of the problems with our Lorenz curve, it does not include what are called in-kind payments. So in-kind payments are essentially payments to people not necessarily in cash, but actually in the form of goods or services. So for example, if you're receiving a rent subsidy, or if you're receiving food stamps, or if you're receiving Medicaid, and I'll talk about these programs later on, these are programs in which you're actually receiving that good or service. You're not receiving the money to pay for those goods or services. For example, food stamps, you're given food stamps that you use to purchase food. So one of the criticisms with the Lorenz curve is that it really just looks at income, not the total picture. And one of the things that I know that we have struggled with, my wife and I volunteer at Paducah Cooperative Ministries, which provides some financial assistance, but it also has a food pantry. And there are certain restrictions on how many times a person can receive financial assistance through the year and how much financial assistance they might be receiving. And the limit is one time throughout the course of the year, and it's a maximum of $100. So we'll sometimes get individuals coming in and they'll need help paying their utility bill. And maybe their utility bill is $25, and they want to come in and get $25 cash so they can pay off their utility bill. And we try to talk them out of that because that's their one time of the year and they're only going to get $25. And one of the conversations that we often have is, if we gave you some food this month, would that free up some money that you could use to pay your electric bill? And the most common response is, I didn't come in here for food. I came in here for some money to pay my utility bill. And we tried to tell them, well, we could give you a month's worth of groceries. Could you then possibly use the cash that you would have spent on groceries and use it to pay the electric bill? And for some people, that's a real challenge for them to understand that it's the bigger picture of all of their assistance that they're receiving. It's not just the cash that they have. The other criticism of the Lorenz curve is it makes no account for how many people are in the household and how many of those people are wage earners. There's a difference between a household of 8 that has 6 children under the age of 10 and a household of 8 in which all 8 are working. There's a difference in income that's going to be earned. The Lorenz curve doesn't take into that account the fact that there are age differences and sizes of families are different. It also looks at income that is received before taxes, not after taxes. So if you're not familiar with this, taxes will take away the amount of income that you have to work with each month. But people pay different tax rates based on how much income they're earning, and based on how much taxes they pay, their income after tax might be greatly affected. And the Lorenz curve also does not include unreported income. So for example, individuals that are working maybe cash under the table, it does not include those figures. It's just looking at paychecks that are reported to the government, essentially. So if we looked at some of these other figures, we get a little bit different picture. So for example, in looking at this distribution of income, below the lowest 60%, so up to that third quintile, those individuals might be receiving transfer payments of some kind, maybe a payment through a welfare or unemployment, Social Security, and it actually might be raising their level of income. Versus those in the top tier might be paying more in taxes, and so that actually is reducing their level of income. So it's generally held that if we include some of these other factors, the income distribution in the United States actually is getting a little bit more equitable, in the sense that some of these programs really are redistributing the income. So let's examine why there are some differences in income. I mean, the reality is the incomes exist, and we really ought to know why those exist. And if we understand why, then maybe we can figure out how to deal with them. So there's lots of reasons why income is different among people. So for example, ages. There's a generally accepted pattern of earnings based on age. Typically, your younger workers are not earning high salaries. Earnings typically rise until about the age of 50, and then they begin to fall again. And then if they enter into full retirement, then there is no income, and it would become zero. So there is this cycle of young people earning lower amounts of income, and that peaks around age 50, and then it begins to decline again. So age makes a difference in terms of your level of income. We can also look at inheritances. Some people do inherit money, and an inheritance is not a form of income. It's really a transfer of wealth. However, if invested wisely, you might be able to use an inheritance to enhance your income. And so the reality is those at the upper tiers, the top 20%, they're probably more likely to be earning some inheritance, and then possibly investing that and using that as a form of income. The reality is there is also discrimination. Discrimination can exist for a variety of factors in income. You can pay people different wages, even though their marginal revenue product, their productivity is exactly the same. If you're paying them different wages, that's a form of wage discrimination. So for example, if you had two workers with exactly the same level of productivity, exactly the same level of experience, exactly the same characteristics, and yet one earned more than the other, that could be considered wage discrimination. You can also have wage discrimination by paying everybody exactly the same, regardless of their productivity. So for example, your most productive worker is earning exactly the same as your least productive worker. And that would be a form of discrimination also. So wage discrimination, we tend to look at in a couple of different ways. One is thinking of it in terms of productivity. And the idea is if we wanted to pay people fairly, we would have what's called a productivity standard, to each according to what she or he produces. So based on what you're contributing, that would be your level of earnings. But we can also have the egalitarian principle, which is essentially saying everybody gets exactly the same wage. Regardless of who you are or what you do, everybody is earning exactly the same wage. That's that line of equality. So another reason that we have wage differences might be education levels. It is a proven fact that the more education a person has, they tend to earn higher levels of income. And so it has been proven that as you advance in your level of education, you will tend to earn higher and higher levels of income. So again, the Lorenz curve doesn't take into account any of these factors. It doesn't take into account the age distribution of the population. So for example, there was a time period in which we had most of our working population was very young. Now most of our working population is very old. And so we looked at the reality that people earn different wages as they age. So maybe that can help explain why those top tiers are earning more. Maybe it's because they're older. We also know that our population is becoming more educated. So maybe that has something to do with it also. But then we can look at the extreme cases, and we look at what's called poverty. And in particular, we look at what's called absolute poverty. So absolute poverty is based on what's called a poverty line. So in the early 1960s, the United States Department of Agriculture looked at how much it costs for basic nutritional needs of a person. And they said, if we can't meet those basic nutritional needs, then we would have sort of this line that we would say, below that, you are in poverty, and above that, you're not in poverty. So this is what's called absolute poverty. Okay, now the reality is you can be above the line and still struggling. But the government would say that's relative. Absolute poverty is based on this thing called a poverty threshold. So the poverty threshold essentially looks at the number of people in your family and the number of children that you have in your family. And it looks at the amount of income that would be needed in order to provide basic nutritional needs for that sort of family. So you'll notice in this graph, if we had 3 people in our family and we had 1 child, so that would mean our poverty line would be around $20,570. So if you earned less than $20,570 in a 3-person home with 1 child, then you would be considered in poverty. You would be below the poverty threshold. Notice the numbers rise. So for example, if you were a family of 9 or more, and you had 8 children under the age of 18, know that I would be praying greatly for a single parent of 8 children under the age of 18, but the poverty threshold is 49,000. So consider providing the needs for a family of 9 or more with an income of 49,000. It's going to be really, really challenging to do. So the poverty threshold is a way of looking at this measure of absolute poverty. If you look across the United States, the percentages of people that are living in poverty, the darker the color, the higher the percentage. And you'll notice through the Southeast, through the Appalachian regions of West Virginia, Kentucky, and then into the Deep South, you have higher levels of poverty. Colorado and Utah typically have a fewer percentage of their population living in poverty. So what causes poverty? There's lots of different reasons. One may simply be demographics. The reality is it's very hard for a young single mother to find adequate income to pay for her family's needs without education, childcare, transportation. These are all issues that might affect single parents. It may not even be a young single mother, it may be a young single father. There are single fathers out there raising their kids. The demographics present some challenges. The other thing that may happen, politics sometimes gets in the way. If the government were to cut some programs, that's going to affect how many people are in poverty. And the reality is there are many people living on minimum wage. There are many people living on multiple minimum wage jobs. I would challenge you, however, to watch the language of these kinds of conversations. Minimum wage is different from living wage. And sometimes the conversation uses those terms interchangeably. The minimum wage program, the minimum wage laws, were never originally designed to be living wages. They were designed to ensure that certain jobs would earn at least a certain wage, but they were not necessarily designed such that all jobs would provide you with a living wage. That's a different kind of standard, to say that anybody who works should earn a living wage. So as you listen to conversations about minimum wage, make sure that you're clear. Are we talking about minimum wage and the minimum wage laws that go with that? Or are we really having a conversation about living wages? How much does it take to provide for a family's needs? So what kinds of solutions might we have? There are a variety of what are called entitlement programs. So an entitlement program is one that essentially says, if you meet our test of standards, you would be entitled to assistance. So for example, with the government, they would say, in order to meet the test for getting food stamps, you have to be within a certain range on the poverty threshold. I know, for example, Paducah Cooperative Ministries looks at the poverty threshold, but they also have some other means that they use to test qualifications. So for example, one of them is they do provide assistance for utility bills. However, if a person comes in, they cannot come in to say that their power will be turned off next month. They actually have to come in with a disconnect notice. And many times the utilities will let you go for a couple of months before they send the disconnect notice. And then you also have to pay down your balance to a certain range. The Paducah Cooperative Ministries would say, we'll help you, but you have to have done a little bit on your own, and you actually have to be facing this crisis. So these are all means that are used to test whether or not a person should get whatever the program is offering. There's also an idea of what's called a negative income tax. So a negative income tax is essentially a program, an idea in which if you earn below a certain level of income, the government actually would pay you money to get you up to a certain minimum level of income. And then if you earned above that income, then you would be paying positive taxes. You would actually be paying taxes. So it's as though if you earned less than this amount, whatever it is, you would be receiving income to get you up to that amount. And then if you earned above that amount, then you would be paying income tax. We have a system of an earned income credit, which is essentially a way of getting to that negative income tax. So I do tell individuals, if you have any wages at all, file your taxes, because your wages may actually be low enough that you would qualify for the earned income credit. And you might be actually be getting money back from the government beyond the refund. Now, one method that a lot of people propose for eliminating poverty simply is to invest in our human capital. The reality is education does matter, but education alone doesn't always do it. So I always make sure that students truly hone their job skills. I've seen many people lose their jobs because they have lack of integrity, they don't work well with others, maybe their job required number keeping ability and they couldn't keep up with numbers, communication skills, customer service skills. If you're going to get a job that requires customer service skills, you ought to know how to talk to people. And if you can't talk to people, then that might not be a job for you. So education is often believed to be a way to help with the issues of poverty. We also have some government programs. I struggle with the idea that the book threw Social Security in this chapter because Social Security actually was never intended to be an anti-poverty measure. It was originally intended to be a social insurance policy. It was essentially a policy in which you paid into it and you insured yourself against the possibility that you would be in old age and not have any way to support yourself. It has turned into an entitlement program as opposed to an insurance program. And so now people have the perception that when they pay into Social Security, they should get a certain amount out of Social Security. The book discusses that this has created a problem with Social Security. The reality is there's not going to be enough money to pay out eventually. So I typically tell students, don't rely on Social Security as your means of paying for your old age, because it might not be there. We have yet to really fix and adjust Social Security. The politicians tend not to like to talk about it very much, but it's going to be a problem. So I would say plan for your old age needs in a different manner. Don't count on Social Security. Another program that the government has created is called the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. TANF is essentially the program that was created in 1996 when we redesigned and reworked the welfare system. Some of the challenges with the TANF program have to do with the fact that there is a limit to how much aid can be received over the course of a person's life. Over the course of a person's life, you have 5 years worth of assistance. And the reasoning behind this was to eliminate the idea of generational welfare. The idea was it was meant to be temporary. The government also created a Medicaid program. So this is medical care that is to provide assistance for those that fall underneath the poverty threshold. And it is a way to provide medical care. So again, this is an in-kind payment, and you're actually receiving the medical care. You're not receiving a monthly check to go pay the bills. You actually have to meet certain standards and go to certain doctors, and then the government helps to provide that medical care. So out of this chapter, you should have learned about the Lorenz curve, the graphical representation of our distribution of income. We looked a little bit about the reasoning behind our differences in income and a little bit about the trends. Within the chapter, you should also make sure you understand absolute poverty as well as the poverty threshold, and look at the trends in how the United States fares relative to other countries. And we also examined some proposals to reduce the effects of poverty. The reality is, in a market system, there will be income inequality. And these are very emotional conversations that people have about income inequality. And anytime you engage in these conversations, I would challenge you to dig a little bit deeper beneath the emotions to make sure that you're actually using the right language for the things that you're trying to express. I've had many individuals who I've encountered that have the perception that we should have an equal distribution of income in the United States, and I should be the richest person. I actually had that conversation with a gentleman. And I said, well, if everybody's earning the same amount, then we wouldn't have the richer and the poor. Everybody would be earning exactly the same. And the gentleman responded that, well, everybody else should be earning the same income. I should get a chance to earn more. And I said, well, that defeats your argument. Your logic is rather circular. And so I challenge you really to dig beyond the emotions, to really think about what kind of discussion and arguments are trying to be presented. I also challenge you to think carefully when you encounter individuals who have certain needs, and in particular those that indicate they would like to receive help. I have a heart for helping individuals. My wife and I will help out at the warming center during the winter. My daughter has helped out at the warming center in Cape Girardeau. We just have a heart for individuals that need help. However, we have learned over the years that while people may say they need help, not all of them actually do need help. And sometimes we get taken advantage of. So I would challenge you to really just follow your heart, and to be careful, to recognize that there are individuals who really are trying to take advantage of the system, and trying to take advantage of the generosity of others. I once encountered a homeless man on the street who, through panhandling, actually earned more income than I earned as a teacher. Granted, I'm not earning a huge salary, but I do have a home. But this gentleman lived on the street, and he told me how much money he was collecting, and he was earning more than I was earning. So I would just challenge you to be careful, follow your heart, recognize that there are people in need. There is no disputing that there really are people that have a great need, not only in this country, but around the world. And our country has mechanisms to provide some assistance. Other countries do not always have those mechanisms, particularly in lesser developed countries. So really follow your heart. But the reality is the inequality in income distribution is a result of our market system. So it is something that we have to deal with, and we have to address the challenges that arise because of income inequality.